Yeah, so what we're going to do is, I believe that I'll just start and then I'll be pitching to Chris here and there throughout based on our preparations and preparatory conversations. But just in case you're interested, we are planning to distribute this remotely afterward through Allison and Neve. So if you missed something or you have a colleague that needs it, they should be able to access it in the future. All right, so our agenda, this was right on the flyer. We're going to try and make sure everybody understands the chronic homeless definition, can effectively capture the information necessary to determine whether someone is chronically homeless at intake, and make sure also that folks can do it consistently, especially for those lost to contact at exit, right? And then any best practices that we have, and I think Chris will offer some tips. We can also, since everybody is unmuted on the line, who is still calling in or using the audio participation method, you can chime in if you have anything that you want to contribute as well. There's also a question module in the GoToWebinar control panel. I am monitoring that as well if you want to shoot me a text question or you have a technical difficulty. All right, here we go. It's going to be exciting. Don't all like shout at once, but it's going to be great. HMIS intake tips. Me not being someone who works for the HMIS provider, this was just some of the brief things that I know we had done as part of point and time count training, and Chris had some other tips as well. But making sure that every question has an answer, even though a lot of times at intake we're maybe rushed because you have a lot of folks that you're needing to enter. Making sure that all of that information is up to date and accurate. In some cases, you may have a 17-year-old on the verge of their 18-year-old birthday. Maybe you need to re-interview someone and make sure that you have accurate information about their veteran status or about their age or about where they came from prior. And just taken care with birth dates and income data, which can easily be, kind of jimmied incorrectly if a key or a number is hit incorrectly, and making sure people are placed in their households as appropriate. But also wanted to pitch it to Chris. Chris, any other just general intake tips that you wanted to point out to folks?
Yeah, before you even get to the intake screen, I really want people to use the client search feature in our Black navigation ribbon.
Sure.
Foothold Technologies recommends that as the way to start any intake. And specifically, they said when you're entering a client's name, that you should only use like the first 2 or 3 letters, the first and last name. Makes it easier to find the person you're looking for.
Sure.
So if you use the search feature, a couple initials from each name, the social and date of birth if you have it. Make sure you adjust the number of results to 200 or 500 so you don't miss anyone. And if you start the process there, you can use the clone feature once you find the right client, assuming that they've been in awards at some point. So yeah, start with the search feature when you're looking people up, and then everything.
So based on background noise, Chris, I'm just going to mute folks who aren't you, and everybody can use the question panel if you have a question. All right, and then we'll come back online for the question section. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. Do you need me to repeat myself or?
No, I think you're good, my friend. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, so start every intake with our search tool. It minimizes mistakes. And also learn that if you look up a client and you find that their name was misspelled on a previous intake, go ahead and clone them anyway. Once you have them in the system, go to their face sheet, and then you could fix the spelling of their name or any little quirks that might be going on. That way you won't have any duplicate clients. And then as far as doing the actual intake, yeah, I concur with everything Jay just said. You want to try to get accurate information in each field. You really want to stay away from data not collected at all costs. Sometimes the client might not know something or might not be able to provide an accurate answer, but just don't pick data not collected unless you guys just really didn't ask a question.
Right. Okay, so another reason why what Chris is saying is super helpful is that if you're starting out with that consumer lookup function, so if you're doing what he said in that black ribbon in HMIS in the foothold dashboard, if you're doing that client lookup with the first couple of letters of their first name and the first couple of letters of their last name, and you see they have a previous entry, you can pre-populate or clone that information into your intake and save yourself valuable time. So instead of having to manually enter every single piece of information, you're just verifying the information about them to some degree so that it saves you time and them time at intake. Exactly. All right. So that's some basic HMIS intake tips, and I appreciate that, Chris. What we promised, and we're going to dive right into, this was the first thing, or the second thing we said we would be able to do by the end of our training today on the agenda. So let's just dive right into the deep end, okay? So as you can see, I have not made a visually stimulating presentation, but this is going to hopefully help you understand the chronic homeless definition. All right, in detail. This is directly from the regulation, and we're going to try to make it fun and or, at least accurate for you. Okay, so chronically homeless means homeless individual with a disability. Stop right there. So this person must have a disabling condition or a disability. And you can see the reference in the rest of that sentence, which is talking about the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, where that definition of what it means to have a disability is listed in the federal code. For our purposes, we are going to dive into that in a little bit in the presentation, but it does not mean just one thing. Or the same thing to someone who's being screened for SSI benefits, or someone who's being screened for eligibility for mental health services. Disability is a broader term than that as defined here, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But chronically homeless persons, in order to be chronically homeless, have to have a disabling condition, either themselves or another member of their household has to be disabled, and it should be an adult member of the household. We'll get to that a little later. All right, next item. Chronically homeless means an individual with a disability who lives in a place not meant for human habitation, a safe haven, or in an emergency shelter. Okay, those are the three locations that you can be and still be counted as chronically homeless. Now, there is a fourth location that falls under the emergency shelter category, okay? Emergency shelter also includes persons in a hotel or motel placement that is paid for by the local welfare agency, so OTA in Morris County, okay? So if there's someone in a hotel motel stay, that counts as literally homeless, and that person could be chronically homeless if they have been homeless long enough or enough times with a disabling condition. Okay, so you've got disability, you've got where they currently are, and then the next paragraph is has been homeless in one of those locations that we just talked about, unsheltered, safe haven, emergency shelter, for at least 12 months or on at least 4 separate occasions in the last 3 years, combined totaling at least 12 months. Okay, so that's 2 separate ways that someone could count as chronically homeless based on the length of time they've been homeless. So it would be, okay, I have someone who's living on the street and they've been there since 12 months ago. That means that they could be chronically homeless if they also have a disability. So that's one way, would be 12 months continuously homeless. And as you can see in the next piece, the it's or on at least 4 separate occasions in the last 3 years, as long as the combined occasions equal at least 12 months. Okay, so it doesn't matter if I've been homeless, if I was homeless once in June, once in July, once in April, and once in September in 2018, if it was all one night each of stay in a shelter or on the street, that's not chronic homelessness, because the duration of those 4 separate occasions does not total at least 12 months, okay? Now, the wrinkle in what separates an episode is right here, okay? In order to be counted as a separate break in homelessness, there must be 7 consecutive nights of not living in a homeless location as described here, so that would be unsheltered, safe haven, or emergency shelter, in order to count as a break in homelessness. So if I was homeless for a month in January in the shelter, and then I got, kicked out or timed out, and then I lived unsheltered, and I lived unsheltered from February through March, that's not 2 episodes of homelessness, because those are all homeless locations, right? Being in a shelter, being unsheltered, both homeless locations. So that's one continuous episode of 3 months, from January in shelter to February and March in unsheltered situations. However, if I was homeless in the shelter in January, and then I went and stayed with my brother and sister-in-law for a week in February, and then I was homeless after they kicked me out for March and April, then that would be 2 separate episodes of homelessness, because I stayed in a non-homeless location in permanent housing, even though it was a temporary thing, with my brother and sister-in-law in the month of February. That means I have 1 month of homelessness in January, a break in my homelessness in February, and then 2 subsequent months of a new episode, or a second episode of homelessness. That's March to April. Okay, so that's what HUD is meaning by a break in homelessness of 7 consecutive nights at least. Okay, so it must be at least a week of staying somewhere other than a homeless location to count as a separate episode. Okay, then you have to account for this as well. Okay, stays in institutional care facilities for fewer than 90 days will not constitute as a break in homelessness. Okay, so what that means is, what counts as an institutional care facility? Okay, institutional care facilities could be a psychiatric inpatient facility, a hospital facility. It could be a jail or prison. It could be a foster care placement. Those would all count as institutional care facilities. So if the person was on the street immediately prior to going to jail for a week, that week in jail, when they get sent out and are back on the street again, that is one continuous episode of homelessness. That 7-day stay in jail, let's say, does not count as a break in homelessness. Okay, there's a difference between the institutional facility stay and a stay in a permanent housing location. Okay, and that, as you can see, is up to 90 days. So if they are staying in prison or in an inpatient psychiatric or hospital stay for 90 days or 3 months or more, then it would constitute a break in homelessness. Okay, and what's important about this as well is that this counts as not just a break in homelessness with regard to episodic homelessness, but let's say a person stays in an institutional facility who's already chronically homeless and they stay fewer than 90 days, they don't lose their chronically homeless status as well as just their overall homeless status. Okay. By the way, I'm just going to keep talking until people decide that they want to send me a question. If you have a question, please make sure you use your control panel on the right side, or in your GoToWebinar screen, and just type it in there, and you can send it out, and we will try to respond to it. All right. So, really key. All right. We've gone through much of the meat of this chronic homeless definition. You have to have an individual or a household with an individual who has a disability. That individual, as a member of that household, has to be currently in a place not meant for human habitation, a safe haven, or an emergency shelter or hotel motel stay. And that person has to have been homeless either 12 months continuously to this present moment, or on 4 separate episodes separated by at least 7 nights of non-homelessness in the past 3 years. And those 4 separate occasions need to total 12 months. Okay, so it is technical. It's getting into the weeds here, but that is the definition of chronically homeless. Okay, now number 2 here, it says an individual who has been residing in an institutional care facility, including a jail, substance abuse, or mental health treatment facility, hospital, or other similar facility for fewer than 90 days and met all the criteria of this definition before entering is still chronically homeless, right? So that's what I said before. Let's say you have someone who's homeless for 12 months continuously to today. So they became homeless last October 2nd, and they're still homeless today on the street. But today they get intaked into a dormitory style substance use treatment program, okay? They are still chronically homeless by that definition for the next 90 days. If they stay longer than 90 days, then they would no longer be chronically homeless on the basis of that 12 months of continuous homelessness. So that's what this number 2 piece of the definition means, is that if you've already met the definition of chronically homeless, you will not unmeet that definition if you get placed in an institutional facility unless it is longer than a 90-day stay. Okay, so I'm going to unmute Neve, or I guess she may have signed off. So Neve asked a question about couch surfing. Okay, it's a really great question. The question is it still considered a break in homelessness? That's what you're asking, right, Neve?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of our clients, they may take advantage. Someone may offer them a bed or a couch or a floor for a week, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, and then does that, you know, affect their status of being chronically homeless? Because from what you're saying there, by the HUD definition, that's not considered homeless. It's a break in homelessness.
That is exactly right. So to answer your question, it is, so it kind of helps and hurts depending on that person's situation, right? Let's say that this is a person who has been homeless 3 separate occasions in the last 3 years, and then they get a temporary place to stay, and they stay there for a couple weeks, and then they're back in shelter or seeking assistance at your drop-in center, and they're on the street, living in an unsheltered location. That means that they now have a 4th separate episode of homelessness, right? Okay. So that could help them, quote unquote, meet the definition of chronically homeless if they're able to stay in a non-homeless situation, couch surfing for a period of time. However, to your point, while they are in that location, they are no longer chronically homeless, right? Okay. So let's do a workshop of a situation. You have someone who, like we just said, has been homeless from, let's say, October 1st of 2017 on the street through October 1st of 2018 on the street. That's a 12-month period. They're chronically homeless because they also have a disabling condition, right? Yeah. But last night, Bleeding Heart Neve invited them to stay the night on their couch, on her couch, right? So that means that technically that night, last night, from the 1st into the 2nd of October, they were not chronically homeless.
Interesting.
Okay, technically, right? So, however, they now have, you know, a 12-month continuous episode, and let's say you only let them stay for 1 night, right?
Yes.
Technically, that was not a break in their homelessness because it was less than 7 consecutive nights of not living in an unsheltered situation. So if it's a really short stay, it doesn't break someone's continuous episode of homelessness, all right? Now, the situation where you just gave the example in, which would be, let's say someone stays for 2 or 3 weeks or a month in someone's basement or in someone's house for a period of time, that would count as a break in an episode of homelessness. So if someone's chronically homeless by virtue of the 12-month continuous definition, then technically once they get over that month of, or they get kicked out of that housing situation or have to leave for whatever reason, they would now have 2 episodes of homelessness in the last 12 or the last 3 years instead of 4 separate occasions, and it would not be 12 months continuous. So technically, they're not meeting the definition of chronically homeless right now. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, got it.
So it's a frustrating nexus. And for those of you who are confused about why we even talk about chronic homelessness, I validate your confusion. The fact of the matter is that this is a very jargony definition that was updated by HUD in 2016. And really, it's a means to an end with HUD. HUD's overall goal is that we as a continuum of care are trying to provide resources to house the people who are the most vulnerable and have been homeless the longest and have the greatest barriers to achieving housing on their own, right? So what they're trying to say here is folks who are homeless frequently, right, and for long durations, which would be the episodic homelessness, or just folks who are continuously homeless and aren't seeking housing or able to seek housing on their own, which would be the 12 months continuous, and have a disabling condition which inhibits their ability to live independently. Those are the people we want to house, and who are not going to get housed without our help, right? But because it's such a technical definition, there are folks who get, kind of stuck in a weird zone of, well, I was homeless for 20 years, and then I stayed on someone's couch for a month, and now I'm not chronically homeless. This is dumb, right? So there are those considerations, but try not to, hopefully those are the minority, the vast minority of situations, because I do think that there are plenty of folks as of now, unfortunately, who meet these definitions in their strictest interpretation, where, we know that they need these resources, these permanent housing resources. So until we have folks who are all boiled down to these kind of, exceptions to the rule of the definition of chronic homelessness, I don't know if you want to comment, Neve, as to how often you think there are those types of situations. But couch surfing is a really important question, because if you are couch surfing, even if you have a tenuous or temporary residence with someone who doesn't, you aren't on their lease or a member of their household, technically that's not homelessness. Technically, that is a break in homelessness if it's 7+ nights.
Yeah, and it is an issue for our some of our clients. Sorry, I'm unmuted. Sorry, for some of our clients, because certain vouchers, I know the SRAP vouchers, for example, required adherence to the chronic homeless definition. So it was very important when we were establishing that. I don't know when it comes up going forward for what certain vouchers require people to be able to demonstrate chronic homelessness. I'm not quite sure right now.
Right. So there are differences between voucher to voucher, how stringent must be the documentation, but if there is a project that requires someone to be chronically homeless, they must document that these folks actually meet this definition exactly to the extent possible, with as rigid a documentation as possible. So it is a tricky bit where we have some projects that are more flexible than others. Okay. Ultimately, however, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to add that the other side of that coin is that while these breaks in homelessness might seem like a barrier, it's also, if you document it properly, you're documenting their chronically homeless status maybe for the next 6 months or something. So while it is frustrating, and I saw this when I was working in Atlantic County, it can help them down the road too. So just wanted to add that.
Right. Sometimes like we said in the example, sometimes having a break in homelessness is the difference between someone having the ability to be counted as chronically homeless with the episodic definition. And sometimes it's an inhibitor because it's someone who has the 12 months continuously who no longer has it. So, it just depends on those situational differences. So great question on that. Last piece of this chronic homeless definition that we want to go to now here is a family, situation, or a household situation. So as you can see in bullet point number 3 of this definition, it says that a family with an adult head of household or a minor head of household, if there is no adult, who meets all the definition in paragraph 1 or 2, including a family whose composition has fluctuated while the head of household was in that situation, would meet this definition. okay, while that head of household was homeless. So take, for instance, there's a chronically homeless person who is living in safe haven or emergency shelter. But when they are able to leave that situation, maybe they go and stay temporarily with friends and family. And while they are staying with friends and family, they reunite with their children who had been taken by child welfare or had been put into the custody of another relative. So those children don't have the chronically homeless history that adult member of the household does. But then that household gets kicked out of their living situation or evicted or what have you. And because they still have 4 episodes of homelessness, that adult has 4 episodes of homelessness totaling 12 months in the past 3 years, that whole household is chronically homeless. Even though the children don't have that homeless history, the household is counted as chronically homeless because that adult member of the household has the disability and the homeless history. Okay, so you can keep that in mind, that just because a household's composition changes, if there are members of the household that would meet the definition of chronically homeless and they're looking for housing together, they are eligible by virtue of that one household member's eligibility for chronic homeless definition. Okay, so keep that in mind.
I have a question, Jay.
Go for it, Chris.
So is it has to be the head of household, or it can be any adult in the household?
It's a great question. So it is any member, any adult member of the household. What this says, the phraseology in the definition is in a family with an adult head of household.
Right.
Head of household is really not a useful moniker in this particular instance. If there's an adult or head of household who is not an adult, if it's just a minor household, if you have kids who are unsheltered, a 17-year-old, for instance, on the street who meets this definition and has a child or has a younger sibling for whatever reason, or a romantic partner, they would be counted as chronically homeless, regardless of which member of the household met the definition. The exception would be that if you have a family, and I don't think that this would happen, this would be an extremely rare situation. If you have a family with adult members of the household who don't meet the definition of chronically homeless, but the child meets that definition, then that's where it probably would not meet the definition overall.
Okay.
But
yeah, that's the scenario.
That's going to be a very rare scenario, I would think, where you have a minor member of the household with a longer homeless history and disabling condition as compared to the adult members of the household. So what it's really just saying is any adult member, and if there are no adults, then a member of the household who meets the definition of chronically homeless means that the whole household meets that definition as a chronically homeless family. All right?
Thank you.
Any questions before we move along on the chronically homeless definition? Don't worry, it's laced throughout our presentation today with regard to references back to why we're asking things the way we're asking them. So we're going to move on, assuming that everyone knows this already, and thank you for bearing with us, all of you experts out there who already knew this. All right, personally identifying information fields when you're doing intake: name, age, gender, race, ethnicity, and household members. We, again, just alluded to families being chronically homeless by virtue of their relationship to another member of their household who is chronically homeless. So that makes it all the more important that when we're entering our HMIS data, that we actually place every household member into the household as needed. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's really important. And again, to Chris's earlier point, I don't know if you want to chime in, Chris, but getting accurate information and avoiding data not collected. Anything else you wanted to add about personally identifying fields?
Yeah, just with regards to the household members, when you're doing the intake, the system's going to ask you after you put the head of household in if there's any other members of the household. So if you already know that, put them in at that point. If you don't have time to put the other household members in, or that information comes to you at a later date, The best way to put household members in would be to go to the head of household's face sheet. At the top of the page, you'll see a link for child and household information. And by clicking that, you'll see an option to add new household members. So that way, the person you add is going directly into that household without any guesswork.
Great. Excellent. So, yep, don't forget about every member of the household. And again, if you're trying to save time at intake and you need to go back, make sure that you go back and enter that information as needed. All right. So we mentioned it earlier when we were just into the weeds of the definition about disabling condition information. All right. So disabling conditions in HMIS intake is not the same definition, as you can see here, as the SSA, or Social Security Administration definition. It is not whether the person has SSI or SSD. It is not whether or not the person is eligible for PATH services or CSS services or any other services by virtue of exactly what their documented disabling condition or diagnosis is. That is not the definition of disabling condition. Okay, for the purposes of HMIS intake, okay, it is that last bullet point, looking to ascertain if the condition is of long-standing duration and the person would benefit or need supportive housing in order to stay housed because of this disability. Okay, so for instance, there may be someone who has a disabling condition, a mental illness, that is not making them eligible for permanent disability benefits, or not making them eligible for SSI or PATH services. But that does not mean that that person, if they have a long-standing mental illness, would not need supportive housing in order to maintain stability in housing, or supportive services in order to support them when they were achieving permanent housing. And that is really what we're trying to ascertain, okay? So that's really, really an important distinction with regard to disabling conditions. Now, please do remember, again, one of the key pieces of this is if it's of long-standing duration, okay? When you enter this information in HMIS, there is, I believe it's still a checkbox, right, Chris, that asks if you check off, yes, this person has a mental illness, or yes, this person has a physical disability. There's a checkbox that asks you if it's of a long duration and would inhibit someone's ability to live independently. That's correct, Chris?
Yeah, that is correct.
So that's really key, okay? Let me give you an example. One person that is going to be put into a project in HMIS, maybe they are getting a hotel motel placement, and that person is entered into HMIS, they receive the bed night, and that person who entered the information, the intake staff, said, yes, this person has a mental illness, but did not check the box that says that that person's condition was of a long duration and that would inhibit their ability to live independently. If you don't check that box, technically, by the chronically homeless definition, that person is not counted as disabled. So that person, even if they've been homeless for years, would not count as chronically homeless in the system, in HMIS, when we ran a report, okay? Which is really important because coordinated entry relies on HMIS data. Guess what else relies on HMIS data? Our point-in-time numbers and our point-in-time data, right? So every piece of information that's crucial to determining whether or not we are ending chronic homelessness is dependent on whether or not the person is accurately described in our HMIS system and their disabling condition is identified as a long-term and severely inhibiting disability. So keep that in mind. That checkbox is really crucial. Okay. Anything else you wanted to add on this brief section here, Chris? There is a little bit more on the next slide.
Well, just
I think we can. Go ahead.
As far as asking the questions go, when you're doing the intake, all the conditions that they list on the left-hand side make sure that when the question is asked, that you're clear that we're talking about permanent conditions. So not someone whose arm is in a sling or has a walking boot on. That wouldn't count as a physical disability. Someone who's operating needs a wheelchair to get around, that would be a physical disability. So just make sure people are clear on what the first half of that question means. And then as far as the second half of that question goes, just to piggyback on what Jay was saying, you can really much infer, by the fact that someone is at your agency looking for housing assistance, that if they do have a long-term disability, the mere fact that they're looking for this assistance is implying that yet the follow-up question should be answered yes. And as far as we understand HUD's guidance, they really expect these questions to either be yes, yes, or no, no. That's when you get special needs, error, or inconsistency messages coming up on your data quality report. If you put yes to the first half of a question and then no to the second half of it, because again, HUD is expecting it to be consistent as either a yes, yes, or a no, no. So just bear that in mind, that people really understand that when they're asking about these disabilities, that they mean long-term permanent conditions, not, a passing illness or situation.
Right. And so one of the things that I'm being asked in the question bar, which I think is a great question, is with regard to whether or not these pieces or this definition of disability includes mental illnesses, which it absolutely does. Okay, yeah. And it probably includes more mental illnesses than people might think, which is why we say it in these general terms of long duration. Because, for instance, one of the crucial ones that I always have questions on is post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, because post-traumatic stress disorder does not qualify someone for PATH services, for instance, in every case, or for community support services if they are, experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. That is not something that qualifies them for those particular benefits. It is not qualified as a severe mental illness per those pieces. However, if someone is struggling to cope and self-medicating and actually is experiencing long-term traumatic disorder that is preventing them from attaining housing, that is a mental illness that is expected to continue if left untreated, and therefore would definitely qualify someone as having a disabling condition. Okay, so that's one of the important distinctions. So it's a great question. The other question was, do you need a doctor's note? And the answer is no.
No.
Okay. There are folks who, for instance, would be qualified as disabled and would say they have a mental illness diagnosis, or a intake professional who is qualified can ascertain that they do have a mental illness, but they may never have visited a psychiatrist or a psychologist or someone who's licensed to provide that clinical service of diagnosis. So the answer is no, you don't need a doctor's note just to be qualified as chronically homeless. However, when they are placed in a priority position for a permanent supportive housing voucher that requires them to be chronically homeless, okay, it could actually be that before they get into housing, that housing provider will require documentation. Okay, so that's an important point. But just to meet the definition, the answer is no. Okay. The other question that I'm getting is with regard to a list of the types of disabling conditions that qualify. So we don't have just a pat list of those that do qualify. However, if you're in the HMIS, you know that there are a list of them that are available to you. And then there's one that's probably the vaguest of all, which would be chronic health condition. However, the specific ones would include mental illness, physical disability, developmental disability, HIV/AIDS, chronic health condition. Are there any others, Chris, that I'm missing? Oh, substance use disorder, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say either alcohol or drug abuse disorder.
Right, right. So if someone is suffering from substance use disorder, there is absolutely a qualification as experiencing a disabling condition. Okay. Just because it can't be diagnosed through the DSM or the standard diagnostic manual, there is no, which I don't know if that's the actual acronym, so pardon me, all you professionals in mental health out there, but there is absolutely a qualification there. Another question that I'm getting, though, is if a person has been clean or sober from substance use disorder for many years, which options should we use under the substance use field? So that's a really good question, and I think that, to be honest, I'm going to have to look into that question. I'm not going to just give you an answer that I'm not certain of, and we can send it along with follow-up information to everyone that is registered to this webinar. I think it's a very pertinent question. I personally know folks who are in recovery, and they are adamant that they are always in recovery, and that it is a long-term condition from which they are always needing to practice their recovery. So I don't know off the top of my head whether or not someone who has been clean and sober and has been walking that recovery road qualifies if they are not actively using. My suspicion is that they would, but I'm not going to just give you an up or down for certain. So thank you for that question. It's a really good question. Chris, did you have any light to shed on that, or would you be in the same boat as me, wanting to make sure we clarify?
Yeah, totally in the same boat. Like, I feel like it would, because like you said, recovery is a lifelong process. But yeah, let's make sure we know 100% before we give the thumbs up on that.
Absolutely. So thank you for that question. It's always a good sign that people are checking into what's going on when you stump the presenter. So kudos to you. So we'll keep going with this. There's still more on disability that we want to go over. Obviously, we're talking about the identification of a particular disability, just like we rattled off a couple of examples there. However, one question that I always get, especially around point in time count time, is, Jay, I'm interviewing this person, or I'm intaking them into HMIS, and they are in a wheelchair, and they're telling me they're not disabled. What do I put? Are they disabled or are they not disabled? And so, as you can see in this bullet point, we're saying we're identifying disability on self-report or knowledge of the client. So if you, in your professional opinion, are able to know that this person has an undiagnosed mental illness that they're allowing to be untreated because they are not wanting to address it, and you have the expertise or knowledge of that person in order to record that, it's important that you do, for their sake, if they are going to be prioritized as a chronically homeless individual, if they meet the rest of the definition. Okay. Anything else to add on that, Chris?
Only thing I would add would be that if you are going to, kind of take control and identify a disability on behalf of the client, make sure that if this was a condition that you noticed upon their arrival, or something that has been a lifelong thing with them, make sure you record that on their intake form, because you want it to show that they had this condition the entire time that you worked with them, not something that you guys diagnosed or became aware of for the first time after intake.
Really good point. Really good point. Right. So for consistency's sake, to show it is an ongoing or long-term condition. Okay.
And then,
and again, go ahead.
I was just going to say that if you did, make the change on their face sheet as opposed to their intake form, even if that is the case, that you did help the client get this diagnosis, that's going to come up as an inconsistency or error on your data quality report. So just be mindful. Not all errors are in fact errors. It's more the system prompting you for inconsistencies, and this is an example of that, as HUD does not always expect housing agencies to help people get these diagnoses and things like that.
Great point. Yep. So make sure you're updating it with the intake field accurately as much as possible the first time around. It's going to help you avoid errors.
Exactly.
And then it can't be emphasized too much, but expected to be of long continued and indefinite duration. Check that box. if that's the case. All right. All right. So moving on to some other subpopulation data. You know what? Let me just back up and make sure nobody else has any additional information to question on the disabling condition section. Obviously, it's crucial in determining chronic homeless status because that is a baseline requirement of anybody who would qualify. So keep that in mind and make sure, again, if you have someone who's in your care who needs assistance because of their disabling condition to live independently, that you check that box. All right, seeing no other comment, we're going to move on to another subpopulation it's really important to identify accurately, and that would be veterans. So not just standardized intake for chronic homeless alone, but to ensure that we are identifying any other subpopulation that might need specialized assistance or a specialized referral. And as we hopefully are all aware, there are very particular housing resources available to veterans and only veterans that are available in our COC. So those would be, for instance, HUD-VASH, or Veterans Administration Supportive Housing Vouchers that are co-operated between HUD and the VA. And that would also be SSVF, or Supportive Services for Veterans Families, which provides both prevention assistance and rapid rehousing assistance to veterans and their families. So really crucial to be able to identify someone who is a veteran, because it may be that there are resources out there that can help them that might not be able to help the person next to them. All right, so have you ever served in the armed forces, or have you ever put on a U.S. military uniform to serve? Okay, everyone who is 18 years or older who is intaked into the HMIS, including children who are maybe starting out in your family shelter or your family program at 17 years of age and turn 18, this question must be answered on veteran status, yes or no. Okay, and the reason that we have these prompted questions after the veteran status moniker in the first bullet is that the definition of veteran is wildly variable. Okay, there are persons who have been honorably discharged. There are persons who have been dishonorably discharged. There are persons who have been in service but have never had active duty. There are persons who have, you know, all sorts of the spectrum of being affiliated with the armed services. So in consulting with some partners who provide SSVF assistance in our COC, they advised that asking, have you ever put on a U.S. military uniform to serve, is probably a good way to ask in order to catch all as many as are willing to identify themselves. Okay, some people might not volunteer that they are veterans, but if we're going to ask, are you a veteran, that may be a very specific trigger in someone's mind, meaning I went to war, or I was in active duty, or any of those more specific things, which is not what the question's asking, right? There are veteran resources that might be available to someone who served and was never deployed. It may be for someone who served but was injured and never actually saw battle and was discharged. And so those are all variables that it would take a specialized veteran service provider to probably drill down on, but we don't want to miss out on the opportunity to make an accurate referral. Okay, so it's not concerned with the technical definition of a veteran. There's no time requirement for service. Okay, so if that person says, well, yeah, but I only made it to this stage. You know what? That means yes, and we got to figure out whether you might qualify for some of the veteran services that we have in our COC. So make sure that you don't just gloss over that with folks. Make sure that you express to them that it also will not prevent them from receiving services. It probably should be a no-brainer, but also want to make sure that everybody knows this should be asked of both men and women. According to our fearless leader, Allison, women vets are classically under-identified and less likely to volunteer their veteran status. So that is really an important piece to note. Don't just ask the guys, ask the gals. however folks are expressing and identifying, we need to know whether or not they served, and we can put it as generally as possible so that we calculate, an accurate capture of their data in HMIS. Any other questions about veteran status? I would say if you do have a question, you can consult our local SSDF providers. Also, one of the points that's here, sometimes in some communities, veterans get the impression, especially if they've engaged with healthcare resources, that if they're a veteran, identifying themselves will prevent them from receiving assistance because they're going to just get sent off to the VA. If someone is hesitant, especially, but you can also just volunteer that answering yes as a veteran that they served will not prevent them from receiving services, because it absolutely won't. It may actually mean they are eligible for additional services, as we just mentioned. All right. Not seeing any further questions. Want to move on to another subpopulation, victims of domestic violence. Okay. Explicitly and especially, we're trying to capture information about persons who are actively fleeing. Okay, we may think to ourselves, well, but people who are fleeing domestic violence aren't in HMIS because of VAWA. Well, that's true for victim service specific programs. However, there are also sometimes a shortage of beds in our domestic violence shelter. Or there are folks who don't know how to access those resources, and they try to access resources through our mainstream homeless system because they need housing assistance in their mind. However, you have someone who is accessing your program, we need to make sure that we're sensitive to their need, but you're also trying to discern whether that household is actively fleeing, okay? Because that does have a relevance in terms of whether they are qualifying as in a homeless location, depending on where they came from prior. There's no specific time frame requirements. Someone who's been homeless because they fled a perpetrator yesterday is just as homeless as someone who fled a perpetrator a month and a half ago and is still trying to flee. So there's no specific time frame. And the information that pulls is, are you currently fleeing? That's the question in the HMIS. Okay, don't just put blanket data not collected unless folks really aren't asked the question. As Chris said earlier, this is one where sometimes people just skirt by it because they assume, and we would ask that you not do that. Just make sure that you are able to answer this question accurately. Anything else on these, Chris, on the subpopulation pieces?
Well, for the veteran one, I would just add that the easiest way to ask that question is, have you ever been enlisted in any branch of the service? I found, again, when I was in Atlantic County, that kind of made it easier for my clients to understand the scope of that question.
There you go. So there's a couple ways to broaden it for people. That's great.
Yeah, and then as far as the domestic violence questions are concerned, that you could always, if you sense any hesitation or unwillingness to answer a question like that, feel free to remind the clients that this software is encrypted. It meets HIPAA data encryption standards, so it's really a secure system as far as only people who need to know this information can access it.
Okay. All right. Another question that I just received is, what defines domestic violence? Does it have to be from a romantic partner? And the answer is no. There is a very much broadened definition as of this year from HUD where they provided guidance. It could be persons who are in a romantic or cohabitating relationship. It could be stalking. It could be intergenerational abuse, elder abuse. It could be any of those things that could fall under a domestic violence or also just dating violence. Those are all things that may cause someone to have to flee their home and become homeless. So it's a broader umbrella than just what people may kind of couch as domestic violence. And the answer is that they do not need to be actively living with their abuser. Okay, if their abuser knows where they live, that would mean that they may not feel safe there or be able to return there. And therefore, that is not a requirement to be defined as domestic violence. Okay. All right. So now we're getting to the meat and potatoes of chronic homelessness in terms of homeless history. All right. So homeless history, why are we asking when the approximate date is that their homelessness started when we're talking to a client? Well, obviously, we're talking about how we can determine their chronic homeless status based on how long they've been homeless continuously. Okay, obviously it's going to impact whether they can access some of the permanent housing opportunities and provides a chance to make sure we are tracking chronic homelessness accurately. It's a really important metric. Okay, so it's a newer question. In the past 2 years, we just started asking it in this way. And so we want to provide some clarity on how we can ask that for maximum efficiency and effectiveness. All right. So what is the question asking? It says approximate date and homelessness and started. That's the 3 pieces. It's a pretty simple question. Okay. But the devil's in the details. So we're asking when their current episode of homelessness began. Okay, so as we talked about in the chronic homeless definition, there may be folks who have multiple episodes of homelessness. Okay, so what we're really asking is, let's say someone's been homeless 4 times in the last 3 years, but they just most recently got kicked out by their brother-in-law 3 months ago. Their approximate date homelessness started would be 3 months ago. Okay, this is not asking in general when someone first became homeless in their life. It's asking their most current episode of homelessness. Okay, how long has this person been homeless in other locations prior to you interacting with them? So if they've lived on the street or in a hotel for the period prior, or in a shelter, those would be the types of locations we're expecting count as having been in homelessness. Okay, and as we did before when we were talking about the definition, that means someone has to have been on the street, in emergency shelter or hotel motel placement, paid for by an agency. It also includes transitional housing or safe haven. Okay, for this question. Okay, if somebody says that they have been homeless in a transitional housing program, however, it will automatically not count toward their episodes in terms of chronic homelessness, the periods of time that they've been in transitional housing. So that's because transitional housing technically doesn't go toward chronic homeless status, as we talked about in the definition. That was not one of those locations. It's just emergency shelter, safe haven, or street. Okay? Really important is what this question is not asking about. Okay? We're not asking about the last time someone had a valid lease and was paying rent. Okay? As we discussed in Neve's example of couch surfing, if I stay with family or friends or in a place that's not a homeless location, regardless of whether it's my place, that's not what we're asking. Okay? That still counts as a permanent location. So that person would not count as homeless during that time frame. So, and I train this on the point in time count. Let's say in my life that I got evicted from where I'm staying now, and I had to go live with my parents. Thank God that's an option for me, potentially. I don't know. They haven't told me. But the fact of the matter is that I would feel homeless, absolutely, right? So if somebody said, "Are you currently homeless?" I don't know what I would say in that situation if I had been evicted from my housing and I had nowhere else to go except to live with somebody else. I might feel homeless. Okay, that is totally valid. I don't invalidate that. But for the purposes of a HUD definition, that's not what we're asking. Okay, we're not asking how long someone's been couch surfing or living doubled up with another household. If they're living in a unit where they have a lease and they feel like they almost can't live there because it's so substandard, okay, that is also not what we're asking. Okay, we're asking about someone being in one of those locations we just talked about, right? In the street, emergency shelter, safe haven, transitional housing, in a homeless situation. Okay, really, really important. So when we're asking the question about approximate date, okay, that's obvious. We're talking about a day and time, or a day, specifically what we're recording in HMIS. And then homelessness, you may have to provide clarity to that person when you're asking this question. And we're going to get into that now. As long as I can change the slide. Here we go. Okay, so we could ask, how long have you been on the streets in another shelter, transitional housing program, or safe haven before coming here today? Right, that's one way that you could ask it. You could make the client specifically aware what you mean by homeless. Don't just say, hey, when did you first become homeless? Or, you know, because first of all, that's not the question. You could say, when did your most recent episode of homelessness start? Or when, you know, how long have you been on the streets in another shelter or transitional housing program? So keep that phraseology in mind. It's just, as Chris said before, the way we ask our question about veteran status, or the way we ask this question, may help determine whether or not we're getting accurate information. Okay. If they provide a date, okay, sometimes it may benefit to just probe a little bit further and say, so since you got evicted 6 months ago, which is what you just told me, have there been any times since then that you've stayed with family, friends, in a rooming house, boarding home, or apartment you paid for, or had a hotel room you paid for longer than 7 days? Right? So basically, since the date that you provided me when you became homeless, has there been any time since then that you stayed somewhere that wasn't an emergency shelter, on the street, transitional housing, etc.? Right? You could ask it a bunch of different ways. So, and then if they say yes, make sure you follow up and make sure you record that as multiple episodes of homelessness, because that will impact whether or not they're qualified as chronically homeless by episodic definition. Okay? And importantly, if you ask them if there has been any time that they stayed for longer than 7 days in a location that was, you know, not a homeless location since what they provided you, you will need to update that approximate date homelessness started. Okay? Because technically their homelessness didn't start then. Their homelessness would have started at the most recent time that they became homeless and they hadn't been in a permanent location for 7 days or more. Okay? So that's a really key clarifier that you could ask to get accurate information about this approximate date homelessness started. Okay? Chris, anything to add here on approximate date homelessness started?
Yeah, just a little bit. It's that the software really guides you through this process, and it starts with the type of residence question. If you hover the mouse over where it says type of residence, it prompts you to ask the client where they slept last night. So again, like Jay said, and like we've been trying to stress here, as long as you are understanding the questions and understanding the best way to ask the questions, it's going to enable you to capture those different episodes. You know, even if they were couch surfing before they came to your agency, you know, if you go through the system and ask them the questions as prompted, you'll still be able to record all these episodes.
Right.
So there's really, as far as I'm concerned, there's really good guardrails leading you through the living situation questions.
So there you go. Use the guardrails. Make sure you're
Exactly.
following those questions. And, you know, it is a new interface compared to what it had been prior. So, you know, based on what you're answering, different questions may pop up to guide you through it. So make sure you follow that protocol. But keep this in mind, that you can clarify with people, you know, and don't take at face value that they understand exactly what you're saying. Because as I become aware when I talk to people, especially who are uninitiated with HMIS around point in time counts, if you don't know what the definitions are and you are asked a question, you just answer based on your gut. of what you think the person's trying to ask you. And so we need to be as specific as possible to help the client give us the information that we are looking to use to make sure we get them what they need. All right. Number of times. So homeless history. We're talking about the number of times they've been on the street, in emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years, including today. Okay. As we just talked about in approximate date homelessness started, don't ask just how many times have you been homeless in the last 3 years. Okay. You can be specific. You can say, in the last 3 years, how many times have you been on the street? In the last 3 years, how many times have you been in an emergency shelter? In the last 3 years, how many times have you been in a safe haven? Or you can ask an amalgamation of those three, but be as specific about those locations as possible that we're asking about. Because, as we said before, if someone asks me if I am homeless or how many times I've been homeless, if I got evicted, even if I didn't go into shelter and I got doubled up with people before I got to my next place, I might count that as homelessness in my mind, right? But that's not what we're asking them for. We're asking them for how many times they've been in the street or an unsheltered location, an emergency shelter, or in a safe haven. Anything to add on the episodes, Chris?
Just if they do identify as being in the safe haven, just clarify with them that they were actually at Wes's program in Homeless Solutions and not some other place or situation they consider a safe haven. Right,
absolutely. And hopefully, if you've done your consumer lookup, you will already know.
Exactly.
Right. All right. Total number of months in those episodes in the past 3 years. Again, talking about total number of months homeless on the street, in emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years. Don't ask how many months have you been homeless. You can specify how many months have you been in those 3 places that we just asked about, the street, emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years. When we were training on the point in time count, we also went into the last bullet point, right? It's just quickly rehashing with that person what they've already provided you with, and then clarifying the information. Say, okay, you said you were homeless on the street 3 times, in an emergency shelter 3 times, and in an emergency shelter 2 times in the last 3 years. The first time you were on the street, how many months were you there? What about the second time, right? And you can go through that history of episodes that the person identified and make sure that you calculate the number of months of those total homeless episodes in those locations. And that's a really important piece I just want to emphasize. Do the calculation of the total number of months for the client and with them. Don't expect them to do the mental math there. That's kind of difficult sometimes, especially when you have folks who are in fluid living situations. And then reaffirm with them the information, confirm it with them. If something got lost in translation, it hopefully only takes a second to just confirm that what you're reiterating to them is correct. I also want to just validate everybody who's thinking right now in the back of their mind, okay, so you're expecting me to get accurate information for all of these technical questions 100% of the time from 100% of the people. And the answer from HUD is yes. The answer from me is I totally understand because folks are dealing with, maybe they're dealing with a mental illness or a substance use disorder or just trauma from their housing crisis, and they don't have all of their faculties focused on these, strange questions to them that you're asking them at intake. We want to be sensitive to that and try to clarify as much as we can what we're trying to ask. Again, most of this is self-report, so we are reliant on this information. That's why we just want to make sure that you guys are all comfortable in gathering the information accurately as it pertains to chronic homelessness, especially because someone who is least likely to answer these questions reliably is probably also the person who is the most likely to need the assistance in the bad way, So we want to be sensitive to that and make sure that we help gather that information accurately. But I want to just totally validate people's concerns before it's even voiced in our question box about, well, what happens when I have someone who I know is giving me false information? Wow, that's hard, right? one of the tools at your disposal is what Chris already provided you, which is that consumer lookup tool. Okay, that may be a good way to start this conversation about episodes of homelessness. If you can see that this person was a client at a local shelter or received a hotel motel placement from OTA or social services, then you can already anticipate some of that homeless history, or you can help jog that person's memory. Okay, so use those tools at your disposal to as great an effect as you are able about homeless history. Chris, anything else you wanted to add here about homeless history in general?
Not so much here. I think those are all really good points. Like so many of these questions, though, if you verify their answers, take the time to really let them have a chance to speak, even if you think it doesn't make any sense or they're not being accurate. It's a good spot to build a rapport and build trust with your clients. And like with everything else that happens on this intake, you could always go back to the intake form and make adjustments so that information is accurate as it was when they entered your doors.
Great point. Exactly right. Okay. Just a note on income and benefits, just because I had the slide and I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware as well. Just make sure that when you're doing income that it pertains to all of the clients in the household. So if you have a chronically homeless household, and only one of those members of the household actually had the homeless history and the disability, like we discussed before, still need to include all of the information about all of the household members as is currently constituted. All right, so just make sure that you're getting that information accurate for every single member of the household. Okay, it's just a note from our sponsors. Okay, now I'm very proud that we decided to name this slide Exit Strategy because I think it's a little bit of a pun. But in terms of this training, CAS wanted to provide training not just on intake standardization, but also on exit standardization. I have a little bit less expertise in this field, but I'm going to punt it a little bit to Chris on just general tips. And then our next slide, I'll just give us a preview, is about which destinations count as permanent and which count as other, so that we can talk about that and how it's really critical in terms of how we're recording the information so we can track outcomes across our system. But there's a couple basic strategies to avoid what Chris has already said we need to avoid, which is the data not collected option. So Chris, if you, I think that all of these I stole from you to put on the slide. So if you just wanted to give us any additional tips that you have on exit strategy.
Okay, yeah, so like we've been saying, data not collected should not be the response. Client refused, like the third bullet point said, covers a wider range of things. If they don't come back for their exit interview, if they disappear in the middle of services, client refused is the choice there because they're refusing to provide that information. Again, data not collected means that you guys don't even care enough to ask the question. The other thing that I would like you guys to stay away from in most instances, easy for me to say, is selecting the other fields. So, for reason for discharge has other there. The destination has other there. So really try to stay away from that in most cases. All right, there are some limited exceptions, but we don't even need to get into that right now. And just like with the intake form, you can always go back and update a discharge form. You could always go back in your roster archives, change information as more stuff comes to light. So like the second point says, if you're able to speak to someone who knows the client, if the client does get in touch with you at a later date, sort of out of the blue or what have you, absolutely go back and adjust that discharge form so the information is accurate. And even before that, like if you've spoken to the client, that they're planning on moving, moving in with grandma, or they have a place in another state they're going to go to, and they do disappear, but what their plans are, use that to fill out their information. And then lastly, while stuff is pre-populated from their last update, make sure you ask the questions. If you have the chance to sit down with them, you know, double check the income at discharge, benefits, health insurance, all that stuff, just to make sure, you know, you're capturing their discharge as accurately as possible. And then the last thing I would say is that the special needs section, those disability questions, if the answers on the discharge form are different than the answers on the intake form, that will come up as an error / data inconsistency. So just be mindful of that. While it might be accurate that yes, you know, person has now been diagnosed with a chronic health condition or something like that, just be mindful of the fact that it will show up on your data quality report, even though it might not be an error that needs to be fixed.
So the way to avoid that, Chris, would be to actually, instead of making that update at exit, to update that at the face sheet and in the original intake.
Right.
Okay.
If it's something that you know was the client's condition when you first started working with them, make the adjustment on the intake form, and that way it'll carry through to the face sheet and the discharge. If it's something that did develop while you were working with them at the agency, put that on their face sheet. Only other thing with the discharge forms is that if your agency does do a summary, make sure that at least in the anonymous summary field that you don't use any personally identifiable information for the client. So all pronouns, no addresses, no socials, anything that might be able to, you know, some way be traced back to a specific individual.
Okay. All right. So as we, you know, just whet your expectations, exit strategy in terms of what the implications are for the destination field. Okay. Really crucial is not just saying, you know, avoiding the other and avoiding the data not collected piece, but is actually accurately allocating the information about what their destination is. So here are all of the options, and this is directly from the APR. If you should care to run one for your program, just because you're not a COC funded agency doesn't mean you can't run an APR and see whether you have any clients that have been discharged from your agency who fell into you know, a category such as other, or temporary, where you think they shouldn't have been. You could also, you know, double check data quality with the data quality report, but the APR is going to give you all of the destinations over whatever time period that you are looking for from your project. So it could be a really useful tool. Permanent destinations, pretty straightforward. We talked about a lot of those in terms of you know, what that qualifies as. However, not as clear would be with regard to what Neve said before at couch surfing. So what if I have someone in my shelter program or in my outreach program who exited my care or my shelter and went to go live with grandma? Now, you know, how do I know whether or not that is a permanent or a temporary tenure? Because as you can see, there is staying or living with family, permanent tenure, and under temporary destination, there's also staying or living with family, temporary tenure. Okay, so that would again be something that only by ascertaining that either directly from the client or from interactions you have with the client about their plans that you could make the distinction between. So, however, this is not a trivial distinction, okay? The implication is actually substantive. So if you, especially if you're, for instance, a permanent housing provider, if you're providing either TRA or rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing assistance to someone, and they leave your program and they go to another type of voucher, that's definitely a permanent destination. But if you have someone who says, you know what, I don't need a voucher anymore because I got married and I'm now going to go live with my spouse, that would, it would be really important that we label that as permanent tenure with staying with family. because that means that as opposed to having a negative outcome from HUD metric perspective, which would be that we had them in a permanent program and then they went to a temporary location, that means they're less stable than they were at the beginning of working with my supportive housing program. Instead of that happening, it would be, oh, good, they moved out of my subsidized project, and now they're going to live with a family member and they're going to be there for the long term. They're long-term stabilized and we've had a positive outcome from our program. Okay, so those are really critical distinction. So make sure that you and your staff have a protocol whereby you can discern those fine lines of distinction with your clients, because it actually is not just, I want to emphasize, not just for permanent housing programs, okay? We have to submit every year for the continuum of care something called the system performance measures. And some of those measures pertain to our non-COC funded emergency shelter, outreach, safe haven, and transitional housing programs. And basically, if you are in emergency shelter in the COC, or if you are in an outreach program in the COC, what kind of outcome do we want for that person? We want everyone to move to a permanent destination, of course. And HUD does too, and that's why they're helping us measure it by making us spit out this report in system performance. So where someone is discharged to is really critical, really a critical piece of us determining whether or not the interventions and the resources that we have in our homeless service system are meeting the needs effectively. Because if we're just taking folks from one temporary location to another temporary location, we're not solving homelessness. We're just managing it and putting people in different places, right? So keep those things in mind. Again, with institutional settings, you can see what those qualify as here. There's, I think, at least 2 more than what I had mentioned earlier, including substance use treatment facility or long-term care facility or nursing home, okay? Other destinations, residential project or halfway house with no homeless criteria. So that's an important distinction, that's a different type of project than one that you would classify as an institutional setting for homeless persons. And then also other destinations would include deceased if someone passes away, and then the all to be avoided other and client doesn't, or excuse me, data not collected, and then that client refused piece that Chris has been trying to direct us to if we have those situations arising where we can't gather the information because someone flew the coop or moved on without telling us. All right. Chris, any other comment on some of these? I hope that everybody, when we send around the slides for your reference following the presentation, that you can, benefit from just looking at this list. If you haven't been privy to your agency running an APR, you may have seen all of these in your drop-down menu, okay, when you're doing the HMIS intake, or excuse me, exit. But it's, well, also at intake in terms of residence prior. But the important piece is to know what the categories are and how it impacts our system. It's a really huge impact if we don't have accurate information about where people are going, because we need every single piece of the system to be working toward getting people permanently housed as quickly as possible. We understand, of course, that sometimes people go from one emergency shelter to another because that's a more suitable environment for them, or there's better service that pertains to their particular needs in transitional housing or in another shelter. That happens. However, just want to make sure that we're labeling those pieces as accurately as possible. Okay, and I also have a comment over here that I really appreciate, which is with regard to coordinated entry. Some projects will discharge to a temporary destination like shelter, and that seems like a positive outcome. Let me give you another example. If you are an outreach provider and you're reaching out to folks who are on the street, or you are providing assistance at a drop-in center, and you discharge someone to shelter who has been unsheltered for 10 years, and they finally decided, hey, this is my time, I'm gonna seek services, I totally and fully agree that that is a positive outcome. Okay. Now, one of the ways we can actually, look at that metric is what's the average length of time people have been homeless and the rate of disabling condition in our emergency shelters. If the average length of homelessness is going up and the number of disabling conditions or the percentage is going up, that may sound like a bad thing, but it may mean that the hardest to serve people are actually getting into shelter. And that could be a positive thing. So it's exactly right. It's about how we look at the data and not just blanket black or white, whether it's a positive outcome at discharge or not. So you can keep that in mind. I definitely appreciate that point in that question. But just want to make sure that everybody understands how big an impact it is to record the destination accurately, because it has a real big impact on how we are using this information to direct whether or not we think we're going in the right direction in terms of the resources we have. Any other questions on the exit piece, or Chris, anything else you wanted to emphasize?
No, those are all really good points, especially the one about not shying away from, whatever their destination is. It could be positive, it could be negative, it's all relative, like you were saying. But I would just add that it's maybe even more important now than it has been in years past with the LSA coming up, because the focus of that report is tracking people as they move between different agencies and resources and states of homelessness. So it's already really important. It might be getting even more important.
Sure. Thank you. All right. I don't see any other questions at this moment for exit strategy, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew that there are HMIS resources if you have a pickle, and you could go to NJHMFAserve.org or HMIS.NJHMFAserve.org, and you can also obviously use the help desk info in awards. That would be your first option, because I think it actually sends blanket messages to most of the HMFA staff to make sure that someone gets on that issue. So that's a really helpful resource. That's a really helpful resource. And so take advantage of those. I just want to put it out there that we're almost at the end of the presentation. So if you have additional questions, put them in the box now. But don't forget about these resources that are already here. You can see that there are guidance on the technical aspects of doing a multi-step intake. So you can walk through the form in video format at this website and use this resource if you have a new staff person who hasn't been to their site admin training or their data intake training or reporting or whatever. There's a bunch of different resources. So please make sure that you take advantage of those or check them out and see if they're helpful to you. I want to thank everybody. You can contact me at this email. I forgot to put Chris Benson's email on here, who partnered with me on this. So I just want to make sure I thank him as well, and thank Allison and Neve for making this possible to provide this to you guys. And Neve, I don't know if you wanted to provide some closing remarks, but you are open to if you are so moved. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that she was not so moved.
She's not.
So in that case, everybody, thank you very much for your time, for your help in providing such great questions. We will follow up, especially on that question with regard to whether someone is an active substance user or if they are in recovery, whether or not that qualifies as disabling condition. We will definitely get back to you about that once we find some information. And so, okay, we're going to have some closing info from our fearless leader, Allison, but she has to call in first. So I just sent her some audio information, and thank you for your attention. So once she's out here, okay, she says she's in. So for some reason, Allison, I cannot give you ability to speak for some reason. I don't know why that is. Sorry about that. So in that case, thank you for everybody for holding. But I do have to wrap it up because I can't figure out how to get Allison to speak. But she would say, thank you, everybody, and really appreciate it. And we look forward to another CAS training, very soon. Yeah, so thanks very much. Have a beautiful afternoon. And thank you for your efforts to end homelessness in our COC and try to get through this technical information as well. That'll help us hopefully end chronic homelessness. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you soon.